Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today as we are finally getting into the first of what are several backlogged interviews that I have here on the podcast that have happened over the past few months. And, as you know, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, we had a special edition with Rack and Joel and Eugene and Quilly, and then we've been putting out interviews and talks related to the Facilitating 5-MeO DMT book, and there are still more of those interviews to come. So that's kind of pushed everything else back, but I have had some interviews over the past couple of months that have just been waiting to come out here on the podcast, and so that is what we are actually getting to today. The first of this backlog is with Griffen Thorne. He is a lawyer with Harris Bracken Law Firm, and he came on the show. Well, I shouldn't say he came on the show. We did an interview almost 2 months ago now, so I've been holding on to this for a while as other things have been developing here on the podcast, but I'm happy to bring this conversation to you today. We spoke way back in April, so it's been a while, and we'll get to that very shortly, but first, just a couple quick announcements. We'd like to thank James, a name you have heard many times if you're a regular listener to this podcast, because James has set up a PayPal account making a small monthly contribution in support of the podcast. And his contribution came in last week, so thank you, James. As I always mention, this is a listener-supported podcast. I should actually make an addendum to that. I should say this is an occasionally listener-supported podcast. In that, I know things are tough. There's inflation and everything that's been going on and gas prices. But, if you support this podcast, if you enjoy the interviews that I put out and the selections from my audiobooks that I make available to you, I welcome you and invite you to make a small contribution in support of the podcast. It's really easy. Just stop by my personal webpage at martinball.net, use the PayPal link at the top right of the page, or sign up as a patron over at Patreon. And of course, big thanks to all of my ongoing supporters over at Patreon. It's not a huge group of people. It's fairly small, but really appreciate that ongoing and monthly support that all of you guys provide. It really means a lot to me, helps support me in the work that I'm doing, and helps keep me going and knowing that the listeners are appreciating what I'm putting out there for them. And of course, in other areas, I'm always available for 30, 60, and 90-minute personal consultations to help you integrate your entheogenic experience or even prepare for. And, I also do work with facilitators and help them review various aspects of their practice. So if you want to set up a conversation, just reach out to martinwball@gmail.com, or you can stop by at nondualentheogenicintegration.com. Okay, great. So we're going to get into Griffen Thorne from Harris Bracken. And in the coming weeks, let's see, we have one more chapter of Oribai's Vision. It's going to be the last chapter of the book. It's coming out next week, and then I'm probably going to be sharing selections from my book, The Entheological Paradigm 2021 edition, which is all about 5-MeO and about DMT and about some other things as well, and just the nature of reality, the nature of psychedelic experience. So I hope that you will enjoy those forthcoming chapters that I'll be sharing with you here. Of course, all my audiobooks are available over at audible.com, at Amazon, and at the Apple Bookstore. So it's all out there. And I'll be throwing in one of my newer tracks here at the end of the conversation with Griffen from my new EP, 12 Strings. And that, of course, is out there wherever you can find music online. Anyway, let's get into the conversation with Griffen. The audio on his end is not the best, so just encourage you to listen carefully. All right. Next week, that final chapter from Oribai's Vision, and then more backlog of interviews to come. Enjoy. Griffen Thorne. It's like the coolest name ever.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
I mean, just what a great name. Griffen Thorne. You work for Harris Bracken law firm. So just looking through the website of Harris Bracken, And it seems like
hmm
there's a lot of different offices. Where are you specifically located?
I'm in our LA office. We have offices, physical office in Portland, so not too far from you. I don't think I'm not super familiar with the geography of Oregon, but uh, and then Seattle's our main hub. But I'm in LA. We have another person in LA too. Really work all over the place though.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm in Ashland, Oregon, which is really at the complete opposite end of the state from Portland. We are the southernmost town, and then Portland would be the northernmost city. But it's not a huge
Mm,
state, so it's not like California where you have to drive all day to get from one end to the other.
yeah.
Yeah, so you're down in Los Angeles, and it's great to have you on the podcast today talking about psychedelic law. It's obviously an area that is undergoing a lot of dramatic changes right now in the world, and we can expect that there's going to be more coming. And I was looking through your own personal page at the Harris Bracken website and saw down at the bottom here that you have your Canna Law blog and your Psychedelics Law blog, and I just went ahead and clicked on that. And man, you have a great blog going here with just so many great titles. We've got Microdosing at Work, Oregon Psilocybin Draft Rules, Training, Testing, oh, Free Oregon Psilocybin Webinar, Oregon Psilocybin Draft Rules, Products, Ketamine Clinics, Oregon Psilocybin Sales in Vancouver, no, Open Psilocybin Sales in Vancouver, BC. So really, it's covering just a lot of different things that are going on kind of actively right now in sort of the legal psychedelic scene. So I think we've got a lot of interesting stuff that we could talk about. But one of the places that I always like to start with people is kind of asking them about how you got into this work, how you got into this space, that this is a relatively new area. I wouldn't imagine that you went to law school and had, maybe you did, I don't know, maybe there were courses on psychedelics law, but this is all developing right now. So how did this develop for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been a series of like unexpected turns with my career. I actually studied music at Berkeley, not the like really good musician Berkeley, but UC Berkeley. And I had no intent of even necessarily going to law school, but I realized I was nowhere near a good enough musician to make a career out of it. Went to law school, wanted to get into like intellectual property or entertainment or something like that. Ended up at a really large law firm here in LA doing intellectual property litigation. I just hated litigation. It's, very confrontational. It was not the lawsuit type of guy. It was not really what I was into. And about 4 years ago now, I came over to Harris Bricken, which is a relatively smaller firm. We have a lot of offices, but they're comparatively speaking, going from like the ninth biggest firm in the U.S., it's a big change. But one of the things our firm does is it has one of the longest cannabis practices around. And I say longest meaning for just business cannabis side, right? Our firm started in 2010 doing business cannabis transactions. Didn't start on the criminal side. There's of course a lot of guys who've been doing it and firms who've been doing it on the criminal side for a lot longer than us. But in terms of like business and transactions for cannabis companies, we've one of the more experienced firms in the market. We've got the Canna Law blog, which we've been publishing since I think 2012. And it just sort of has been a natural progression over to psychedelics as that's kind of come into effect. For us, I mean, I want to say 2018 or 2019, we started dealing with more, which, I'll leave it to you. Some people do consider it a psychedelic, some people don't. For all that's worth on the legal side, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more later, there's a lot more of a straight and narrow pathway to like legally operating ketamine clinic than there is to anything else in the psychedelic space at the moment. So, that's been going on for a couple of years. And as psychedelics have increasingly become legal or getting closer to becoming legal, we have people who are on the ground doing stuff in various states. Like, so uh, we have an office, as I said, in Portland. They are dealing with Measure 109 stuff a lot. And one of our lawyers is on the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, I think is the name of it. It's the panel that was created under Measure 109, which, if you're listening and don't know what that is, it was the bill that legalized psychedelics or I'm sorry, psilocybin in Oregon. And so there's a panel that was created to sort of study the law and various other things and to figure out how to regulate psilocybin sales for licensing that's going to start, in January, potentially maybe even a little earlier. So we have someone who's on that board on the license. I think he's on the licensing subcommittee helping create the regulations. And yeah, we blog about this stuff all the time. One of my areas where I'm interested the most is like the religious use of psychedelics, right? Besides just ketamine, I really am keyed into these issues. Spent a lot of time writing about it. It's a really fascinating area of the law, which at some point today, I imagine we'll discuss a little bit more.
Yeah, and you're sort of in a hotbed down there in Los Angeles that there are various quote unquote psychedelic churches that are operating down there. Up here, we also have the Santo Daime Church, which had their kind of landmark 2009 case that they brought against the federal government and secured their right to access to drinking daime or ayahuasca within their religious ceremonies. And then we also have a lot of underground stuff that happens in our area. So it's a very interesting area of law. So in transferring from a really big law firm to a smaller law firm, and it sounds like most of the offices are kind of on the West Coast, where sort of a lot of this is really happening. Like California, Oregon, Washington, and then moving all the way up into Canada and Vancouver is all very progressive around issues of psychedelics and access and sort of the transformations that are happening in healthcare. So it's a growing area of culture and society where we do need the legal frameworks for how this is all going to be developed. So it sounds like both the firm and yourself, you started with cannabis law then?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we still do it. That's what the most of my work these days is cannabis work. In California, I do a lot of deals, as it happens in Oregon with our lawyers up there too. Because frankly, for psychedelics, as we sit here today in 2022, they're just not the same kind of opportunities as there are in cannabis, where you have state laws, right? So, as lawyers, we have ethical obligations to advise clients on how to comply with law. And in most states, there just aren't legal psychedelic regimes. Ketamine is the big exception, as I mentioned earlier. But, in California, for example, you just can't go and sell psilocybin. There's no psilocybin dispensaries, at least legal ones. So as we sit here today, that practice is not as large as it will be in the next few years. Certainly in Oregon, everybody in Oregon who's doing this stuff is going to have just a ton of work. 2023, 2024, 2020, just forever basically. But right now, yeah, there are only very few areas where there's actively people trying to comply with the law and even laws that authorize things.
Yeah. So, I've had other lawyers, on the show. Most recently, back in July of 2021, I had George Lake. Maybe you're familiar with him. He works on entheogenic churches, and actually he's going to be having a book coming out on that subject fairly soon. So we spent a lot of time talking about the DEA and the scheduling process and all of that, but maybe we could start a little bit there with talking about the different levels of schedules for drugs. And you've mentioned ketamine a couple times, and that's an interesting one because unlike cannabis or psilocybin, that I think ketamine is like a Schedule 2 or possibly even a Schedule 3. I'm not certain which one, but maybe if we could just kind of start there with what is the law regarding scheduling, and then how does that impact access within society?
Okay, so let's take a time machine back to the 1960s, all right? I want to just make this as comprehensive as we can so people can understand. But early 1960s, an international treaty is signed. A lot of countries around the world sign it. It's called the Single Convention on Narcotics. And basically the point of that treaty was to create a harmonized drug regulation system around the world so that you didn't have one country in, let's say, the United States, outlawing heroin, but then it was totally legal in another country and it could be transported. We just didn't want the mess. So a bunch of countries banded together and signed this convention that would obligate them to adopt laws internally to regulate drugs on a similar basis. And what came out of that was a law in the United States passed signed by Richard Nixon in 1970 or 71 called the Controlled Substances Act, which is part of a broader law. In Canada, they have the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act or something like that. And they're all basically similar in all the signatory countries to this treaty. And what they do is they break drugs into one of a number of schedules. So in the United States, there's 5 schedules. Schedule 1 is for like the hardest drugs, I'm doing air quotes right now, but heroin's on Schedule 1, and things that are on Schedule 1 are supposed to have no medical benefit, be extremely dangerous, and there's a third criteria that it slipped my brain, but really the stuff that kills you and is extremely addictive and has no redeeming qualities.
Yeah.
If you go down each schedule, they become less, at least in the eyes of the Nixon administration and the legislature at the time, become a little bit less severe. If you get to Schedule 5, you're talking about normal over-the-counter drugs, right, in some cases. Schedule 2 contains things like OxyContin. I think cocaine's on Schedule 2, ketamine Schedule 3. So we just it's sort of moving down. And if something's on Schedule 1, which for this call is important, most psychedelic drugs are on Schedule 1, right? So LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and all these new ones, they're just the DEA constantly tries to add them to Schedule 1. So if something's on Schedule 1, it's basically there's not going to be any sort of easy commercial market for it. Cannabis is the big exception. And even to research, if you're a college or something that wants to research something that's on Schedule 1, it's a tremendous amount of money and work. And so, I've had people in the past call me and say, let's just petition the FDA or something to allow us to have a psilocybin dispensary. Just not going to happen, right? It's period, end of story, not going to happen. But if things are on Schedule 2 and below, that presents different opportunities. So, like I mentioned earlier, like OxyContin is a Schedule 2 drug. So that's routinely prescribed by physicians. And there's really strict protocols for how they can, prescribe things, how it has to be stored and handled in pharmacies and transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And ketamine is a little bit lower than that, but those drugs can be administered and prescribed by physicians, or in some cases, depending on the state, other medical professionals, potentially like a registered nurse or something, nurse practitioner. But yeah, there are strict protocols, and it's very different from cannabis, which is, we basically, it's on Schedule 1, federally it shouldn't even be a thing, but people violate federal law with cannabis all the time, and federal government doesn't really do anything. These other drugs, if it's on a lower schedule, it really is complying with DEA regulations is a really serious undertaking. So, for businesses that want to pivot from cannabis to ketamine, which is a constant, we get these calls a lot. It's not going to be the same. Cannabis is hard to comply with the regulations on a state-to-state basis, but once you get the DEA involved, it becomes a lot harder, and you have to have doctors and things like that. So, circling back, and why I think this is key is that a couple of institutions right now are in the process of getting FDA approval for psilocybin and even MDMA, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that has a pretty good shot of happening in the next few years. What I think will happen once those companies get approval is that those specific drug formulations will be moved to a lower schedule, probably Schedule 2. And so it won't necessarily mean like anybody and their brother can go open up a psilocybin or MDMA dispensary or whatever, but it'll be regulated very similarly to ketamine, how it's regulated today. So we have a framework actually to determine like what that will look like in 3 or 4 years' time. It's just a matter of waiting. I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background, but
that's okay.
The perils of working from home.
Yeah, it's the barking actually is not coming through. Mine's out right now. She might come back at any time and knock on the door and ask to come in, and then want to go back out and bark at the deer in the backyard. So yeah, let's spend a little bit more time talking about cannabis, because this is sort of I like to call it like it's a low grade psychedelic. It's not an overtly over the top psychedelic when you compare it to something like psilocybin. But it alters our perception of space and time. It alters our sensory experience, and it's working at a neurological level. We have our natural endocannabinoid system, so it's attaching to receptors, which is different than, say, like alcohol, which is essentially a poison that we're introducing into our system. So, it is in that psychedelic family. And now we're kind of living in this sort of bizarre patchwork around the country where the states have just taken it upon themselves to say we're either, most states started with medical, and then many of them have now moved into recreational. And I think it was just even last week or even a few days ago, I think the House passed the Decriminalization of Cannabis Act, which everyone says, well, it's not going to go through the Senate, so it's not going to happen. But what do you see is going on with that sort of patchwork legal system with cannabis, and how might that inform as things develop in the more intense psychedelics, the more traditional psychedelics? But let's just talk a little bit about this whole kind of odd legal situation we have with cannabis right now.
Yeah, and like I when I talk to other lawyers or like rooms of like legal audiences, I think you got to decouple the reality from like the words on the page. We as lawyers often get like hyper focused on law and precedent and what statutes say, and but really you got to think about like the common American citizen and what they want. And there's a big difference between cannabis and psilocybin or any other psychedelic, right? If you
Yeah.
take cannabis, if you smoke it or eat it or whatever, you're just not gonna have this. I know some people classify it as a hallucinogen, which is, I mean, the people who did that classification maybe never consumed cannabis, but or maybe took way too much, but it's just not the same. And so like the threat of somebody getting behind a car, yeah, people can have problems and slows down maybe some of your motor functions, but psychedelics, it's like not even on the same wavelength, right? And so there's a lot of risks with it that just aren't there. And, people are scared of this stuff. The average voter in, flyover state is not going to take the same stance with cannabis and psychedelics, at least not for the time being. But so that I think informs a lot of this, right? And that's why I think if you look at what Oregon did, that's what I think you're going to start to see across the country. So what Oregon did with Measure 109 is to say, look, if you're over 21 and you can come to one of these facilities that will open next year, and under the guidance of like essentially a therapist, they call it something different, I think a facilitator, you can consume psilocybin and you stay at the facility during the time. You don't get behind the wheel of a car and drive. You don't bring it home. You take it there, you have your session, and then, there's some follow-up sessions at the end and you leave, right? And the beauty of that, and why I think voters accepted that, is because it eliminates a lot of those public health and public safety risks of people driving when they're on it, right? So I don't think personally we're ever, or at least not for a long time, we're ever going to see like a dispensary, right, for psilocybin, where you can just buy it and take it home. I don't think any state you're going to convince social conservatives of that ever, right? It's not going to happen, no matter how much you can tax it. It's just a risk that I think these people are not going to want to agree to. Now, the big difference from a legal point of view, and this is what I think people have glossed over or just not really gotten into, is that, cannabis, most of the states that have legalized have done so in the last 10 or so years, right? Whether we're talking about recreational or medicinal. Before that, there were a few states that had jumped on board. California had the Compassionate Use Act in 1996, which didn't legalize it. It just gave you an affirmative defense if you had it and you were prosecuted and you had it for medicinal purposes with a physician's recommendation. But in the early 2000s, states started coming online slowly. What really spurred it, though, was a 2013 federal policy memo by the Department of Justice, a guy named James Cole, who's an assistant U.S. attorney in the Obama administration. And he put out this, 3 or 4 page memo that basically said, here's the federal government's position. if states follow these 8 priorities, we're going to make enforcement of cannabis laws basically a non-issue. And those priorities include things like preventing cartel activity, preventing kids from getting cannabis, state-to-state stuff, drunk drive, or driving under the influence, public health stuff, basically. If states can adopt systems that prevent this, then we're just not we'll take a backseat role, right? And in that, if you look at any cannabis regime that's come out of it, like the California law that came out in 2016, 2017 that allowed adult use sales, you can tell it's very clearly influenced by those 8 priorities, right? They're built around those priorities. And so it was the framework by which we've all adopted these regulations, and everything exists today. If it weren't for the Cole memo, we'd be in a completely different era. It was rescinded by Jeff Sessions because, Trump's attorney general because he hates cannabis. But it still is basically the de facto position of the government. And we don't have that with psychedelics yet, So I think what's going to happen is sort of something similar with cannabis, where states are going to do what Oregon's doing. It's been like Oregon was like the what's the term? They were like the first people to do this, and now every other state is following suit, right? They're the early adopters of this. Oregon's like the gateway drug of adopting a psilocybin legislation, right? And so I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see a bunch of other states adopt laws that look pretty similar, and the federal government's eventually going to have to do something. The big difference is it going to be Biden who says something, his regime, or the next guy, right? Or the next president. If Trump comes back or DeSantis comes back, it's not really going to look great, right? Even if there's an industry in place by that point. So I think states have to act pretty quickly. And I think the Biden administration should adopt, should do something soon, right? They should say something soon. I get a little nervous because Biden can't even get his act together on cannabis, right? He just doesn't seem to approve of it. He said on the record before that he doesn't want to completely legalize. He wants to move it to Schedule 2 or 3, which is just, in my opinion, a little crazy. But, so it's going to be similar, but we just need that federal guidance in place. And I imagine what it's going to look like across the country when states come on board is very similar to Oregon. In fact, Washington proposed a law. It didn't go anywhere in this legislative session, but Washington proposed a law, which some of the guys in my office actually were instrumental in helping with that process. And it would have been very similar to Oregon. So I think that in-house consumption model is what we're going to see come across in other states, over the next 5 years.
Yeah, so we have the states kind of taking the lead on this, and then also there's been just the general decriminalization movement that it tends to go sort of district by district or city by city, which is also taking place. And then it is interesting that we currently have a president whose son, Hunter Biden, received psychedelic therapy in the form of 5-MeO-DMT with secretions from the Sonoran Desert toad, and credits that with actually saving his life and helping him overcome his own opiate addictions. So that does seem to present an interesting window or an interesting opportunity. Yet, as you say, at the same time, that Biden has not really stepped up with this issue with the reclassification of cannabis, which maybe let's just talk about that for a second, because as you stated, that one of the conditions to be on Schedule 1, federally illegal, that cannot be given out as a prescription, that would need to be a Schedule 2. One of the aspects of Schedule 1 is that it has no health benefits or no medical uses. And, when it comes to cannabis, we're just at a point where it's obvious that is not a correct assessment. And we're getting much, much closer to that with things like psilocybin and MDMA. But even because it's Schedule 1, as you say, it makes it so very hard to even study it in a medical or university setting, because there's already a law that says, no, it has no medical uses. It's already scheduled as this. And that's what Oregon has ignored and said, well, actually, psilocybin does have medical uses, and that's why we're going to be opening it up to therapeutic practices. So how do we move something from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 if we can't even test it? And why why isn't there more recognition at the federal level, like even just with cannabis? Again, that the House just passed the bill. It's not going to go through the Senate. So we're not going to get a schedule change for cannabis. But why not? Why? How can they continue to deny the reality of all the medical evidence? I mean, this is just kind of perplexing. Other than that, we could just say, well, politicians are messed up, society's messed up. There's been a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of entrenched positions, but it does seem pretty basic. There are medical applications. Let's reschedule it.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with more with that sentiment, and I think everybody in the industry couldn't agree more. I mean, it's crazy, and the only explanation I have is just politicians suck. They just suck, and they don't do things that are consistent. I had no idea about the Hunter Biden thing. I mean, that's it's just like the cherry on the cake. Like his own son has used this stuff to his benefit, and yet we're just going backwards. I mean, more of these drugs are now going to be added to Schedule 1 potentially in the future. It's like tainted. Cannabis was so demonized for so many years that it's just really tough. And I think it's just going to have to be a matter of time, right? There is so obviously a benefit to cannabis for certain things, right? You don't even have to talk about things like cancer or other diseases, right? But like pain management, you just can't be denied at this point in time. To do so is insane. And yet the government has basically taken the position that I don't understand it. So what needs to happen is either a piece of legislation needs to be passed by Congress removing it from Schedule 1, which seems to be possible, and I'll talk about that in a second. Or, and I'm not an administrative law guy, I don't really understand the functions of the DEA to the extent of this last point. But one of the things I read about kind of frequently is that the DEA can reschedule drugs on its own. It's sort of a different process. So that could happen too. But, with Biden as president, it just doesn't seem like that's going to happen, right? It seems like a low priority with everything else going on. It just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So the Congress side, for everybody, we've been talking about the MORE Act, which is the decrim law that was passed by the House last week. And why that's not going to go through the Senate, there's two reasons. Number one is Republicans, because it's a Democratic bill. It goes pretty far on the social justice side, and it just things that Republicans don't really want. It's also hyper-partisan stuff these days. Anything that's passed by Democrats, oftentimes Republicans won't touch, and vice versa. But there are even some Democrats in the past that have said things like, we won't vote on cannabis legislation unless it includes, the very hyper-progressive stuff that they want, right? Which is, there was I don't even keep track of the names because these things have zero chance these days, but there was the one that would have granted, they wouldn't have rescheduled cannabis, but it would have allowed banks to have safety if they bank cannabis money. It's the Safe Banking Act.
Yeah.
And Cory Booker said, I'm not gonna do this because it doesn't, remove convictions. And it's like, it's frustrating because at the same time, like, it could be helping a lot of people out there. We have to deal with political reality where we have literally half the House, the Senate is Republican, who's just not going to vote on something like that. So it's just a lot of political stalemate. And at the end of the day, the people who lose are not the people in Congress, but the people who A, are employed in the industry, B, who could be employed in the industry, and C, the people who have pending convictions, right? So unfortunately, it looks like there's going to be a very red Congress in the fall. And if that's the case, I think there's of federalization or very little. Although I will say, with one glimmer of hope, there's the States' Rights Act or something, whatever it's called, which was a Republican-introduced bill in the House, which would essentially legalize cannabis and leave it up to the states to regulate it, which I think, frankly, is not a bad idea because the states are already regulating it, right? You wouldn't have to have this massive sea change that you would have if you unified everything in the federal government. So I would welcome that. It's like, as long as you get something out there that removes cannabis from Schedule 1 or provides some benefits, we need that, right? And we need it in order to progress with psychedelics. although the attitude coming with psychedelics seems to be a lot different than it did with cannabis, right? Everybody seems to acknowledge now that there is at least some benefit to certain psychedelics. It just seems like beyond question at this point in time. And the fact that the FDA has allowed, I think, 3 or 4 companies, and MAPS is one of them, to study MDMA, and there's 2 companies doing psilocybin. It just seems like a matter of time. And once that happens, again, very different dynamic, because you have doctors who can prescribe it. Doctors can prescribe things for off-label use, and you'll see a proliferation. Wow, I can't talk today. A proliferation of these facilities all over the place, like overnight, I think, is what's going to happen. Just my prediction, but yeah, the federal government, don't trust it to do anything. It's going to take a lot of time, bureaucracy, and at the end, not get it right.
Yeah, and it's kind of frustrating with the idea of certain players, they want to change everything, and so then they resist maybe the piecemeal approach. Like you were saying with Cory Booker, and it comes to things with even just like banking. Like, can cannabis companies, can they use a bank, or does everything have to be cash? And then does that make them more susceptible to robberies or theft? And just there's so many hurdles. And this is, as we've been talking about, that this is a place where we haven't seen the same level of hurdles when it comes to ketamine, because it already is at a lower schedule. But this whole issue of how we're categorizing things as being medically useful or having medical applications or not just seems like a really fundamental level where things need to change at the federal level. And we're at an interesting place in American history now where, pretty much a strong majority of Americans support the idea of legalized cannabis, that they don't buy it anymore, that this is something that we need to be protected from. But as you say, it is a harder sell with more classic psychedelics, because if you're getting a 5-gram mushroom journey in a therapist setting, there's no way you're going to be getting in a car and driving around. But there's that fear. And then there also is the fear that it's going to create perhaps mental imbalances, or people are going to have flashbacks, or they're going to have bad trips, and so there are legitimate concerns there, but it doesn't necessarily override the fact that maybe we have a medical right to these. And then also what we haven't talked about yet is then the idea of having a religious right to have these kinds of experiences that is made accessible through these substances. Maybe we could talk about that now. You said that that's a special area of interest for you. So maybe we could start with, why is it a special area of interest for you? And then what do you see going on in this area? And how do you see yourself as being able to be of use or applicable to people who are working on the religious use of psychedelics?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. You have a good point, which is the medical right. This is before we talk about the religion stuff. It's an interesting point. I mean, I don't think constitutionally there's like rights to, there's no constitutional right to take medicine, right? It doesn't exist. But the federal government has right to try laws. And there's actually a lawyer up in your neck of the woods, Catherine Tucker, who's litigating against the government now, for that very reason, to get right to try access for psilocybin, I think, for terminally ill patients. So that's like ongoing, right? And I tend to be one of the kinds of people who think, and I think it's a sort of almost like a libertarian philosophy, that the government shouldn't really have a right to tell you what you can and can't put in your body, right? It's a pretty common position these days among people of all political persuasions, but basically, why can some bureaucrat say, no, you can't put this in your body if it thinks it's going to help you, right? It just doesn't, it's not even harmful drugs, right? If, a person wants to take it, they should be free to do that. It's something that is a personal choice. But in any case, and that's what, Oregon has essentially recognized that in decriminalizing all drugs. Yeah. And I think other states will follow suit. To turn to the religious stuff, though, I don't remember exactly how I figured this out. I mean, I always have been interested in constitutional law. I think most people think they're interested in constitutional law. It's just like a fascinating, even if you're not a lawyer, it's just, it's like a fun area to talk about rights and the government's ability to like interfere with your life, and the impacts of everything. And I remember early on when I was writing about this stuff, I came across some cases and just decided to do a deep dive. And I am where I am. There's like so much we could talk about. I don't really know where to start. I guess people have been doing psychedelics for beyond recorded history, right? And a lot of it has developed for religious purposes. Look at South America, look at Africa, Central America, even I guess North America, right? Peyote.
Yeah.
This stuff it's ubiquitous, right? And early on, even before the Controlled Substances Act, the government recognized that like there are Native American groups, irrespective of federal law, that have been using this stuff as a sacrament. And so when the Controlled Substances Act was codified in the 70s, the DEA's predecessor agency, I forget what it was called, they passed a regulation that says, hey, Native American church, you can use peyote under certain circumstances for religious purposes. And, over time, that's been expanded to allow other Native American groups to use peyote. Of course, it's funny enough, Oregon took people all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to essentially take, I'm oversimplifying this, but essentially take away rights to use peyote, or, government benefits for people who were terminated for using peyote illegally. And what happened was eventually, I'm going to gloss over this. In 2006, a big case was decided in the Supreme Court, federal Supreme Court. It was either a 9-0 or like 8-1 decision. So you can see like all the justices agreed that said the O Centro Church can basically use an ayahuasca plant for sacramental purposes under the First Amendment, right? Which the First Amendment grants religious liberties or prevents the government from interfering with the certain exercises of religion. And it created this test, this essentially 3-part test, where you look at the government action, does it substantially burden a legitimate religious exercise? And the religious exercise part is like, you have to look at whether it's a religious and B, sincerely held by the practitioner. They were the first people to, express, besides those Native American groups, but they were like the first group to get that recognition. And it took going up to the U.S. Supreme Court to deal with that. You talked about this earlier, Santo Daime Church, they got it too. They also had to sue the federal government. And what happened was the DEA put on, like literally, you can Google DEA religious psychedelic exemption. They put this like janky 4-page document on their website, like in 2009, saying, hey, if you want to use psychedelics for religious purposes, you have to like submit a petition to us. And here's what you have to put in your petition. It has to be signed under penalty of perjury, meaning if anything is false, you can go to jail and be prosecuted. You have to explain where you're going to get the stuff from, which of course people in the drug industry love doing. You have to tell the government where you're going to use it. The real nutty part, in my opinion, is you have to explain like what your religion is.
Yeah.
Which like, why should the DEA be in charge of like, determining whether a religion is legit? I've never really got that. And then the big part that I think is like a huge, huge problem is that you have to promise not to use psychedelics until you've been given the petition. It's been granted, right? And what's happened is like this. None of this was like approved via regulation or anything. The DEA just, like I said, put this thing on its website, and that's certainly not the protocol they should have gone through legally. And don't respond to these petition requests, right? And people submit them. I don't know how often exactly, but they just basically go into an envelope somewhere, and the DEA doesn't even really acknowledge them. They sit there for years and years and years, and these people are supposed to withhold using this. And if they use the psychedelic after submitting this, they can be denied on those grounds. It's crazy. So, a few years ago, lawsuits started against the DEA. One group called SoulQuest out of Florida sued the DEA. They're actually still dealing with that lawsuit. they got a denial only after suing the DEA, and of course the main point of that denial was, we don't think you're like a legitimate religion.
Yeah.
And we can talk about like what that means to be a legitimate religion, but like basically, you know, you have the DEA saying we're gonna be the arbiters of like what religion is, which is crazy. And then so that case is actually still ongoing. They're now fighting that one. There's another case. I think it's in Arizona. Arizona Yage Assembly is suing, the federal government, and one of their claims is that the whole exemption petition process is illegal. Like I said, it was not done via regulation, which is essentially a rule that has to go through those processes, and it violates a lot of other stuff. I mean, again, like if you have a religious belief that requires you to use psychedelics once a month, and you have to promise not to use it for potentially years, like it seems to me to be a pretty slam dunk case of a violation of religious liberty. And like ironically, or interestingly at least, if any of these cases wind up in the Supreme Court, the fact that we're now a 6-3 conservative majority with like some very religious conservatives, I think is pretty good news for the psychedelics industry, because, or the religious people, the people who want to use for religious grounds, because like these people are going to strike down this government action. I mean, I don't see things like letting these petitions sit in the drawer for 6 years. That just doesn't seem like something that's going to make Sam Alito or Brett Kavanaugh happy, right? They're just, so I think the composition of the court right now, and I won't say this for like almost any other drug issue, but for the religious liberty issue is actually good, right? So that's eventually going to happen too, unless the DEA changes its position. So right now the landscape for religious organizations that are doing this is that a lot of them are just doing this stuff and ignoring the DEA because they know it's a waste of time and they don't want to commit to not using this stuff. And the position a lot of them take is, if we are sued, then we'll fight it on the grounds that our religious liberties are being violated. It's not a position I think is a good one, because there is something on the books. It shouldn't be on the books. There's a process for doing it. People should I think petition and then sue the DEA. But I mean, I certainly understand why groups are doing it this way. I'm very sympathetic to what they want to do. It's just they're really in a bad place because of how the DEA is treating this stuff.
Yeah, and I just really want to emphasize that point of why does the DEA have any kind of authority to determine what a sincere religious practice is or is not? So I myself have my PhD in religious studies, and I can tell you, as someone who comes from that discipline, it is highly debated within religious studies over if we can even define what religion is from any kind of neutral standpoint. So, for example, I've been laid off from Southern Oregon University because, just like many universities, there's been big budget cuts from low enrollment through the pandemic and all of that. But up until a couple of years ago, I was teaching religious studies courses at Southern Oregon University. And the first thing we start with is I ask students, okay, define religion. And then what we would do is we would go through their answers, we would find that almost all of their answers were Western biased. In other words, they're coming out of the Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions and have a certain understanding of what religion looks like, but then you throw up something like Taoism or certain forms of Buddhism, and none of the definitions that they gave fit. And then, so then is Buddhism a religion? Is Taoism a religion? And kind of entering into that philosophical discussion of what makes something religious. And here we have the Drug Enforcement Agency, who has zero training in the discipline of religious studies, and they're supposedly the ones making the determinations. And then it's you kind of point out this bizarre irony that they don't really have the authority to do this, but they've done it. And then why hasn't Congress stepped in? And then I do like this next layer of irony that actually, with having religious conservatives on the Supreme Court, it actually might be more friendly to this idea of protecting religious freedom. Because if they're not, because I know that there's a lot of hypocrisy that goes on at the federal level with these things, but it does seem like pretty basic. Also, when it comes to the issue that conservatives tend to promote this idea of states' rights and that states should be able to choose, yet they don't necessarily support the reformation of marijuana laws that has been going through the states. So there's a lot of interesting and kind of curious ironies in there, but I do think it's incredibly problematic that we have a government institution such as the DEA having the authority to determine what is a valid religion versus what isn't. That, in my opinion, they are simply not qualified to make any kind of determination there. Yet they still try and do that.
Yeah, it's nutty. I mean, and this is all because the Supreme Court talked about sincerely held religious beliefs, and so they're like, "Aha, we need to make sure you have a sincerely held religious belief." Although, like, Jeff Sessions issued memos in a very different context for religion, saying, the government has this is not our job to determine religious beliefs. It is where we are, and I agree with you that it's a very hard thing to define. I mean, you know this stuff a lot more than I do, for sure. But if you look at that religious exemption petition guideline from the DEA, they ask things like, "What's your religion's holidays? What's the, like, describe your," I don't know, I'm just sort of like going off the cuff here. It's been a minute, but describe your, like, deity and all that stuff. And it's not necessarily the case that all religions would have that. And, or have all of those criteria. And I mean, I feel someone told me about this recently. I haven't done the research yet, but there were apparently some conscientious objector cases, people who didn't want to be involved with the military or something. And I think the Supreme Court had talked about the fact that, a spiritual belief that's not necessarily tied to religious practice is still religion or something to that effect, right? So, like, if I'm a person, hypothetically, if I were a person who felt like I could connect with some higher power or something, if I just took psychedelics and that would improve my life somehow, why is that not a religious belief, right? Do I need to have a deity? I mean, or what if it's something you can't explain with words? I mean, anyone who's taken this stuff in the past knows that a lot of it is not something you can easily put into words, right? So, even explaining that on a form to some pencil pusher at a federal agency, I don't know. You think about it in another context, like, I'm Jewish, this weekend's Passover. What if the federal government said, no, you can't do Passover, right? You got to wait until we say you can do Passover. It's absurd to think about. Or you can't do Christmas, right? You can't do whatever holiday. It just would never happen in any other context. And yes, I get here that there's drugs that can, in some cases, harm people. A little bit of a difference, but if you strip these concepts down to their core, there shouldn't be a difference. And I think eventually that will be recognized. It may take years to wind up in the courts, but yeah, I fully agree. And I think a good middle ground would be if the DEA were just to make people attest that they did, in fact, have a sincerely held religious belief. Like, obviously, people would abuse that system to do psychedelics. I mean, of course, there would be some people out there who would lie, but what's worse, like having illicit markets out there, or having, government sanctioned markets where this stuff could be done in a somewhat safe manner? Because, like, even for the religious groups that have gotten exemptions, and there aren't many of them, they still have to, the DEA will still force them to do things for public safety, right? And I think on the net, having more of that is a good thing than the status quo now, where people risk going to jail or have stuff that might be contaminated, or may not even be what they think it is that they're taking, right? So, like, yeah, it's just crazy to me that the government has decided that this is the hill to die on. I mean, there's so many other ways that they could reject these petitions, but SoulQuest denial letter, which I've written about a couple of times, is out there on the internet. You can, like, most of it has to do with, we don't think you're a valid religion. I think there are actually some good lessons to be learned for these religions, which is like, what SoulQuest did, which allegedly was a problem to the DEA, was that they talked about religion, but in much of their communications really couched it as therapeutic stuff, and like, didn't, make the religious part a core component of their overall, like, organization, right? At least according to the DEA. So groups that are doing this for a sincere religious purpose need to, think about how they're presenting themselves when they apply and actually stick to their guns. And I still think even then the DEA is going to find a way to deny this. Going back to the conservative thing, there's another case that's going on right now in federal court. A group called Ayahuasca, so like the state Iowa, IOWASKA, it's kind of a pun name. They had sought 501(c) status from the IRS, their psychedelic church, and they also had filed one of these exemption petitions like 3 or 4 years ago, and of course nothing's happened. And they're suing the IRS right now. But one of the interesting tidbits in that case is that they somehow got Senator Chuck Grassley, who's like a 90-year-old conservative in Iowa, to like go to the DEA and beg the DEA to advance their petition, and it didn't work. And it just is interesting that you have these like really social conservatives who are coming to bat for these organizations, and it's one of the few areas where I think you're seeing that right now. And it is because, like, if you set precedents that cede power to the government to intervene in religious practice, even in something that they may, as conservatives, not like drugs, it could have a ripple effect, and it could affect things that they actually do care a lot about, social conservatives, right? That I'm sure certain of these things, a lot of like the religious activists on this side wouldn't agree with, right? Some of the conservative viewpoints. And it's just an interesting area where you're seeing some very strange bedfellows. And that's one of the things I think that draws me to it, is you just sort of never know where things are going to go. With cannabis, it's like, yeah, you're right. You would expect a 6-3 majority court to like say, no, let's leave it to the states. This is a bullshit scheduling decision back in the 70s. We have ample evidence to make that call now, but like the last case that someone took up to the Supreme Court, they didn't even hear it. This was like 2021, right? So I think at the end of the day, we're going to need to have the court some duking it out in the federal courts, and specifically, hopefully in the Ninth Circuit, which tends to be pretty progressive on this stuff. It's just not. It just needs to be clarified.
Yeah, there's a few issues here that I'd like to pick up on. And one is this idea of the DEA coming in and asking, like, okay, so what are your sincerely held religious beliefs? And like, even there, we are starting from a very Western assumption of what religion is. That it's defined by what you believe. When we look at the panoply of religions around the world, many religions define themselves by what they do, not by what they believe. And that belief, faith is a central idea in Western religions, but not all religions. And even there, the idea that the average person participating in the religion should be able to explain what those are, that also is a bias. So you mentioned you come from the Jewish tradition. Well, there's Torah study in Judaism. And so particularly for males, it's very important to be educated in the tradition. Or if you're raised Catholic, you go to catechism. But other religions don't necessarily have that. Like one of the textbooks that we used in my religious studies classes dealt with the Shinto religion in Japan. And it says right there, most Shinto priests cannot explain to you what the Shinto religion is because they don't think about it that way. But if you ask them, what do you do? They'll give you an extensive answer. This is what I do as a Shinto priest. But what do Shinto believe? Versus if you go to like ask your average person, what is Shinto? They would say, I don't know. And it's even in Japan, the majority of Japanese people will, if you ask them, they will say they are not religious. Yet, everyone in Japan is a registered member of both a Shinto shrine and a Buddhist temple. So, again, it's these presuppositions about what we think defines religious belief, religious practice, religious adherence. And then another issue that you've mentioned that I think is extremely important, and I've written a lot and talked a lot about this, is that because this is also something that would come up in my class with university students. Most students these days, most young people, they do not identify as religious. Yet, the majority of them also do identify as being spiritual to some degree. So they are engaging in what they feel is the sacred in some capacity, but they don't want to identify as being this religion versus that religion. They don't want to have that identity, and they want to have the flexibility that, well, I'm going to borrow a little bit from Buddhism and maybe do some yoga and do some meditation, and then, maybe even go to church every once in a while. But I'm not Christian, right? I'm spiritual but not religious. That is the new defining category of quote unquote religious identification. Yet our laws are not constructed in such a way to deal with that, because again, we have this expectation that if a religion is a well-defined thing and is a group of which you are a clearly demarcated member, and that you should be able to recite what the central doctrine of it is. But these are all assumptions. These are Western assumptions about what religion is, quote, supposed to be or look like, but it's not really matching the reality on the ground of the social situation of where people are really at. So the law here is really lagging behind the ways that society has changed over the past few generations. And a big part of that is with psychedelic spirituality and psychedelic religion, that this is something that's happening on the ground. The laws haven't caught up with it yet. And
yeah.
So something that you haven't mentioned yet, and I was just wondering if you want to talk a little bit about. So one of the fallouts from that Oregon case with the individual who's participating in the Native American church went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, you can believe whatever you want, and so you have religious freedom. But when it comes to taking a drug, sorry, we have these drug rules, so it doesn't apply to you. And then that inspired Congress to create the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and also the Native American, specifically the Native American Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which recognized there is this exemption with peyote. So it sounds like the DEA's, are they trying to enact the Religious Freedom Restoration Act by coming up with their own rules to carve out exemptions, or is what the DEA doing, is it completely outside the bounds of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? How would you analyze that?
So why don't we talk about, we'll frame this up a little bit, because I'm sure most of the people listening are not super familiar with the technicalities of this stuff. So in the 80s, there was these two guys who got fired from work for consuming peyote, Native American guys. They went to get unemployment benefits. The state of Oregon denied them because they had been fired for violating state law, which prohibited consumption of peyote. So they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court twice. The case is called Employment Division of Oregon versus Smith. And basically, the Supreme Court said what you just said, except their point was, we're not going to overturn a state law that is generally applicable, meaning it prohibits everybody in the state from using drugs. It's neutral on its face. It doesn't expressly discriminate against one group just because in this one case it affected you guys. And that case set out like a massive domino effect. I cannot underscore this enough. Massive domino effect with religious conservatives who were like, holy shit, this is going to affect us in like many different ways that, with everything from like abortion to, just every religious issue you can think of, right? And they really lobbied hard for the next few years. And finally, in the 90s, Congress passed this law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This was 1993. It's called RFRA as an abbreviation. And that basically said that laws of general applicability, like these neutral laws that apply equally to anybody, they can be illegal if they substantially interfere with a sincerely held religious belief. I might be misquoting the exact test to some extent. I've written about this before, though. And then that was the law. There was another Native American law passed in '94 by the Congress that was broader and with respect to a lot of Native American groups allowed peyote. But Gonzalez versus Ocentro was the 2006 case I mentioned a few minutes ago, that relied on RFRA to say the Ocentro church folks could use ayahuasca, and they went through that whole balancing act, and they said, oh, Is this a substantial interference? Yes, because the DEA would otherwise not allow you to import and use this stuff. Do you have a sincerely held religious belief? Yes. And so, yeah, the DEA basically looked at RIFRA and they said, we'll make these guidelines. And they did it in a way, my opinion, that is most favorable to them. And, look, a lot of people really hate the DEA. I always just pause and say this for a second. A lot of people really hate the DEA. And there are some things that they've done in the past that I think are really bad, right? And objectively speaking, with the war on drugs and certain things, they have a very clearly defined mission, right? Which is to prevent the spread of drugs outside this closed loop system that they like to refer to it. This is one of the areas where I think the agency can be very paranoid and really grasp at things, and they don't like to see control, right? And that's what you've seen happen since the Gonzalez case, the Ocentra case. There are other ways in which I think the DEA does a really good job of things, like regulating prescription pharmaceuticals and ketamine, for example. They don't necessarily do a really good job. They just have a very clear function, and they function more like you'd expect a federal agency to. But when you get to like cannabis stuff or hemp, how they treated hemp for the last couple of decades until the Farm Bill, and even now after the Farm Bill, it's just crazy. Like they don't want to like give over the reins. And I can see that here too. So with these other drugs, yeah, it's frustrating. And I know I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but yeah, it's just an area that I think we need to see some change in.
Yeah, and something else that kind of comes to mind as we discuss all this, again, going back to this idea of like who's defining religion and what impact does that have at the societal level, that within religious studies, one of my main areas of emphasis was actually Native American religions and Native American traditions. And here, reading like old accounts from explorers coming from Europe, that they were all coming to the Americas, and then they went back to Europe and they said, oh, all of these people are ripe for conversion because they don't have any religion. There's zero religion in the New World. And it's just another example of just how blind from that Western bias of what constitutes religion, that they didn't even see it when it was right in front of them. And then in the creation of the United States and the federal government and the creation of the reservation system, I mean, just like you were saying, like, just imagine if the government came in and said, you can't do Passover, or you can't celebrate Easter, or you can't celebrate Christmas. And that's exactly what they did with every single Native American culture on every reservation in the United States, that they said, actually, you have to pick one U.S. holiday per year, and then you can legitimately have a ceremony that year or on that day, but you can't have ceremonies any other time because you have no religious rights, you have no religious freedom, and we're going to dictate to you. And that actually made it all the way into the era of the Native American Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that when they looked at, how are we dealing with indigenous peoples in the United States, like, shit, we've still been colonizing them. It's actually still been active genocide has been taking place. So there's a lot of parallels there with what has happened to Native Americans and just the cultural blindness over, again, what constitutes legitimate spirituality, legitimate religion. And on top of that, governance over the reservations was handed over to missionary organizations. And so they were all Christianized at the same time. And then also, I mean, if we go through, like I was just reading the other day, like what constitutes genocide, because we're looking at what's happening in Ukraine right now. And one of the lists that really stood out to me was children are removed from their homes and then put into an educational facility where they're not allowed to participate in their culture. And that's exactly what happened to indigenous people in the United States and in Canada as well. They were taken away to these boarding schools. Not that that's what's happening in Ukraine right now, but again, I was just looking at the list of what constitutes genocide. And so we have a lot of deep issues here that actually expand beyond the realm of psychedelics into how has the United States, how has Western culture dealt with non-normative practices that are outside of their own cultural scope, and the idea of actually being more inclusive. And I think we've come a long way with indigenous people. but now we're dealing more with these countercultural traditions or subcultural traditions within Western culture, where I think that we need a lot more expansiveness, because we're dealing with a lot of the same issues, but it's a different clientele in a sense.
Yeah, and I think the treatment I mean, it's just don't have to say it, but obviously the treatment of Native Americans in this country and Canada and elsewhere on the American continent has been horrendous, to say the absolute least, and barbaric and things like that. But if you look at the Constitution, and how it was written, First Amendment specifically in the Bill of Rights, which frames this whole discussion, they talk about the exercise of religion, right? And so obviously they did not, the people who wrote the First Amendment were white Christian dudes. They just weren't. They didn't have in mind the spiritual practices. They weren't, again, as you said, they weren't exactly religious practices in the same context as Christianity. They clearly didn't have these things in mind, because at the same time the government was taking those rights away, right, and trampling on them. So the one area where I do sort of want to walk back my comments earlier, where I talked about conservatism in the Supreme Court, is that there's this concept called originalism in jurisprudence. And basically, when we're looking at laws, or especially when we're looking at the Constitution, which was written, hundreds of years ago, if it says, like, the Second Amendment's a great example. We fight about it all the time, right? It says Congress shall make no law that infringes on, I'm paraphrasing, you can't infringe on the right to bear arms. What does it mean exactly to infringe, or what does it mean to bear arms? All these different these phrases, right? Mm-hmm. Words are never perfect. You can't have a law that perfectly conveys every potential situation. So one of the ways to analyze the Constitution that's employed by conservatives, who's really pioneered or championed, at least, by Scalia and Thomas, who are arch conservative justices, is you look at the words in the context of what they meant when they were written. And under that framework, it obviously is naturally the system that conservatives would latch on to, because it's a traditionalist way of looking at things. If you look at the First Amendment through that scope, it becomes much harder to talk about the right to be spiritual but not religious, right? It's just right. Clearly that sort of stuff wasn't even on the radar in the 1700s, 1800s, right? And but at the same time, even by that standard, I think they would still have to acknowledge the rights of Native American groups. And frankly, by now, there's been so much in other statutes that has recognized those rights that I think, I don't think the right for the Native American church to take peyote is going away anytime soon. But I do think there are still so many different blind spots. We can, people can debate all the time about some of the issues in America, about acceptance of others and how the systems have been structured here, and there's debates are happening all the time. I don't think this is an area where there can be much debate. These groups were systematically discriminated against, and that's just the lightest way to put it. And this is just one key thing where yes, for some of these groups, it was actually a very central part of their practice, and no, you just can't do it. I just don't. I mean, you just have to imagine what would happen if it went the other way around, and I just don't see that being. I just don't see that being okay. And when you had all these countries all over the world who maybe didn't even have the native population we did, coming together with these treaties, the Single Convention, and then the psychotropics one in the 70s that outlawed this stuff. We're a tribe that existed in the Americas for thousands of years, and some dude in Europe is going to tell us we can't. How does that make sense, right? How does that work? And so I am happy to see that those policies are reverting now. In fact, since the 70s for peyote, for at least one Native American group, but there's still a very long way to go. I mean, there's still a very, very long way to go. It's by no means resolved. And I think I think that there is some very strong legal argument for religious use of psychedelics generally, and why the DEA is not doing the right thing, like the spiritual but not religious folks are probably going to have a harder battle than like the Santo Daime Church would, because it's just a different thing, and it's a lot easier for conservatives to wrap their heads around the latter.
Yeah. Well, I've had you for a good long while here. You're a lawyer. I know hourly rates run high, so I don't want to keep you too much longer. And I really appreciate your time and your expertise that you shared with us today. And so we've really kind of talked about just how sort of complex and messy the situation is right now, yet we're also at a really kind of interesting pivotal time where things are changing. So I guess to kind of wrap it up, I would invite you just to share anything that you feel that we haven't really covered that you think is important. And also if there's just anywhere that you feel that things are moving in a positive direction with all of these changes that are happening right now.
I think I'll be clear. Like there are a lot of problems, and I like to highlight the negatives because it's just so much easier to do. But we have made an immense amount of headway. I remember in 2019 when Denver decriminalized psilocybin, and I was like, this is never going to happen. There's just no way. And it was a very narrow approval. And since then, it's just been like Denver was the gateway drug.
Yeah.
Every city's like rushing out. Denver does psilocybin. Oakland's like, all right, well, hold my beer. We're gonna do all psychedelics. It's just like the next, and then it's Oregon comes along, and we're gonna legalize it. It's just the floodgates were opened, and I think that's really cool. And I also think it's really cool that you see interest at the actual federal. The FDA is like potentially going to approve treatments of these things. How cool is that? People want to be involved, and there's a lot of opportunities for people to be involved. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to have a lot of money. You can get involved with local decriminalization efforts that are happening. It's too hard to even follow. There's so many of them. I would just say for people considering these things, like be realistic in the outcomes, and circling back to what we talked about at the beginning, that we have to recognize that there are a lot of people out there who either they don't want this or they don't want it to the same extent that maybe advocates would want. And like a perfect example of that is there was a proposed ballot initiative in California that was called like the California Psilocybin Initiative. And they'd been proposed. It made it, the Attorney General had, I don't know the exact term, but basically they were at the signature collection phase, and they didn't get enough signatures, and they gave up, right? And it was, in my opinion, because the bill was like very much, would have been like extremely hands off, more so than our cannabis legislation is here. So like with that kind of stuff, I think people just need to be realistic and focus for now on decriminalization efforts and persuading the state legislatures to look at Oregon and to look at what Oregon's done and to look at the successes. I think Oregon's Measure 109 is a very good example of how states should regulate this in the future. I think the authors of the legislation had looked at all the failings with cannabis around the country and all the potential issues with the federal government. I mean, we talked about the Cole memo at the top of this thing and the priorities the federal government applied to cannabis that hasn't yet happened for psychedelics. I think they're exactly met in this psychedelics bill in Oregon. So I think, we're going to start to see more states come online. It's just a matter of time. And like this time in a decade, we'll probably be dealing with like cocaine law or something crazy like that, right? It's like psychedelics will be established. It's just a matter of time. I say that as a joke. I don't necessarily want there to be like a cocaine bar on every street or something. That would probably be an issue. But yeah, I think that it literally is happening. And this is not something that we could have predicted 10 years ago. I'm excited to see what the future holds here.
Yeah. And, as someone who's been kind of in this public space since at least 2008, that's when I started this podcast, I never imagined that here, some 14 years later, we'd be talking about these legalization procedures that are underway. So there's been a huge amount of transformation just over the past couple of decades. And so it's exciting to see where it's going. And let me just ask you one last question. Do you think that there are enough lawyers working in this area, or is this a ripe area for more people to get entry into the legal space?
It's a tough question. I think there are definitely going to be more people getting into the space, but there just depends on the opportunities available, right? So as those things increase, then yes. I think once you see a lot of the really big firms jumping in, then like we'll be in a completely different landscape. Like that's happened in the last few years in cannabis, where like the mega firms who jumped in, who didn't initially want to jump in, and they're usually much more conservative in things. Once they've jumped into this, that means it's an established industry, and that they don't think there's a risk anymore. So, yeah, the more people jump in, the more it means that it's harder for the government to take it away. I actually am writing an article that's coming on their blog tomorrow about why do prohibitionists for cannabis, like, even what do they think they're going to accomplish? Like the states are 70% of the people want cannabis, like 90% want medical cannabis. 250,000 employees across the United States. States are just going to just stop all of a sudden. So once these industries start to exist, it becomes much harder to take them away. So yeah, I'm all for it. Get the lawyers involved, get the cultivators involved, get the therapists involved. The more people, the better.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Griffen. Really appreciate it and bringing your
Yeah.
expertise and experience into the conversation today.
All right. Thanks, Martin. Talk to you soon.
All right.